Right. Try that again. Welcome to the House Environment and Energy Committee. We are picking up where we left off last week with the Agency of Transportation testimony from excuse me. Wow, I did a good job when we were muted.
Nailed it.
Nailed it. Third time's a charm. We are welcoming with us Marion Woltz, the Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator for the Agency of Natural Resources, who we were unable to hear from last week when we had our joint hearing with Transportation Committee. Welcome, Ms. Woltz.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for having us back. I appreciate being with you here this afternoon. As Chris Sheldon said, my name is Marion Woltz, and I'm the Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator at ANR's Climate Action Office. Here to share with you today some of the work we're doing in the Climate Action Office as it relates to building resilience to climate change impacts for Vermont and our communities. My slides will progress here. So as you all are well aware, the Global Warming Solutions Act was enacted in September of 2020, and it established the Vermont Climate Council and charged it with writing a climate action plan that, among other requirements, must identify strategies that build resilience to prepare the state's communities, infrastructure, and economy to adapt to the current and anticipated effects of climate change. That climate action plan was adopted in December of 2021 and includes recommendations to reduce emissions, build resilience and adaptation, and sequester carbon. The CAP also included a recommendation to establish a body within the executive branch to ensure coordinated climate action across state government. About 6 months after the climate action plan was adopted, a climate action office was established with the FY23 budget, charged with working collaboratively within and outside ANR to state climate vision and to lead and coordinate and track climate action. The Climate Action Office has staff with expertise in greenhouse gas mitigation, adaptation and resilience, carbon sequestration, communications, and data analysis. We're setting up a system to monitor and track climate work across state agencies. We're establishing public access to and understanding of climate action, and are working very closely with the Environmental Justice Unit at ANR, which supports the implementation of Act 154 to ensure that we're centering frontline and impacted communities and all of the work we're doing to address climate change. As the Climate Action Office was established to support a state vision for climate action, an interagency advisory board was also established to provide a space for proactive coordination on climate action across state government. This interagency advisory board, or IAAB, as you'll hear me say, includes representation from the Public Service Department, Agency of Transportation, Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont Emergency Management with Stephanie Smith, Agency of Agriculture, Buildings and General Services, Human Services, Commerce and Community Development, as well as the Vermont State Climatologist, who you heard from at your last joint testimony with Transportation.
How many staff are in the climate office?
We currently have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we'll be soon hiring. So I mentioned we have 3 folks that are really focused on greenhouse gas mitigation. Myself with adaptation and resilience. We have a communications and community engagement coordinator, and we'll be soon hiring someone with a focus on carbon sequestration and natural and working lands. And then all led by Jane Lazorchek, who will be here soon, I believe.
Your pretend friend.
So there will eventually be a staff of 7. We're at 6 right now. So specific to resilience and adaptation, which is really the focus of my work, I'll be sharing with you all today the ongoing and planned work in the Climate Action Office as it relates to resilience and adaptation coordination across state government and with partners within and outside ANR. I'll speak to technical analysis and tools in just a moment and get into a bit more detail on the work we're doing there. In the strategy and program development space, we're really focused on resilience strategies and programs that are supporting work across state government on incorporating a climate resilience lens into existing work. I think you all have heard from folks and will continue to hear. There's a lot of work happening on adaptation and resilience across agencies within state government. This isn't a new space, and the Climate Action Office is really providing that platform to help coordinate that work and speak to how we pull that into sort of our day-to-day conversations about the impacts of climate change on all of our work. A few examples of the strategy and program development. We granted to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development additional funds to add a focus to their designation and evaluation reform study to add capacity to dig further into climate resilience research, targeted engagement, and additional recommendations specifically around climate solutions in our downtown areas. ACCD, or the Department of Housing and Community Development, will be, I believe, has come out with the report, the Designation Evaluation and Reform report, just last week, I believe. And the report for the climate recommendations will be coming out at the end of January. So we're looking forward to partnering with ACCD on that and sharing that report that really includes recommendations of how to build climate resilient strategies into the designation programs.
Excuse me, can you say one more time? You asked them to add something to their other designation study, and just one more summary of what you asked them to do.
Yeah, so we, following the flooding in July, ACCD had already taken on and had under contract Smart Growth America to do this evaluation of the designation programs, right, that are run out of the Department of Housing and Community Development. There was a small focus within that initial scope of work on climate resilience and really better incorporate actions and supports for communities that are in the designation program or interested in being in the designation program for climate resilience. But acknowledging sort of the impacts of flooding, there was interest in sort of expanding that scope of work. And so we granted funds from our climate action budget to the DHCD to sort of expand that scope of work within their existing contract with Smart Growth America. And so what it looked like was pulling in additional expertise in climate resilience, sort of in compact settlements and with Smart Growth America. They did an analysis or really a look at both within state programs and external to state programs, best practices on incorporating climate resilience into supporting downtown and economic community development centers, and are going to be producing, again, at the end of January, sort of an addendum to that designation reform study that really speaks to how recommendations for incorporating climate resilience into the designation programs. As I noted earlier, the Climate Action Office is also building a tool to measure and track climate action. Building that tool includes also establishing metrics for climate resilience, and we're embarking on that process with partners within the Interagency Advisory Board, and then specifically Vermont Emergency Management, Public Service Department, Agency of Transportation, and DEC, to ensure we both know what we can track and ensure that we're building this tool, thinking about long-term what we should be tracking to better understand outcomes and impacts of our work on building climate resilience. So that's the measuring and assessing progress tool that the Climate Action Office is currently working through the RFP and responses to the RFP. And a big component of that will be establishing a process and building metrics for climate resilience so we can get a better sense of our work in the climate resilience space and really the impacts that's having on communities. We're also coordinating closely with Vermont Emergency Management, with Stephanie here, on how the Climate Action Plan and the State Hazard Mitigation Plan can better iterate off each other when it comes to climate resilience, with the goal of using those plans and others to articulate a statewide vision for resilience, as well as being able to iterate off the actions needed to implement that vision across multiple planning efforts. So those are ongoing conversations we're having to really speak to how can the State Hazard Mitigation Plan and the Climate Action Plan that both have focuses on climate resilience better iterate off each other and build off each other for the actions that are included there. You all may have also seen the recent announcement from the Governor and the Treasurer's Office to build a resilience implementation strategy. The Climate Action Office will be partnering in that effort with the Treasurer's Office and the Governor's Office. We began meeting with them just this week to start to discuss the framework to develop that strategy, and much of it will build off existing work planned within the Climate Action Office. And then broadly in the communication space, the Climate Action Office is working on communications support for climate action, both within ANR and external, thinking about how we communicate out the results of the work we're doing to track climate work in state government, as well as communicate out program coordination for various audiences and partners. So taking a step back, you all heard from ANR colleagues at the testimony last week, as well as Dr. Dupigny Giroux, the state climatologist, about the impacts of the July flooding, what we've learned, and how agency programs are really addressing these gaps. The events from this summer, early droughts, poor air quality due to wildfires, frosts following unseasonably warm weather, and the flooding from this summer and winter all heighten the importance and urgency of cross-sector and cross-agency coordination to support communities and people who are feeling the impacts of climate change every day. In conversations and stakeholder engagement on tools that I'll get to in just a moment, what we've been hearing as needed supports is really more urgent following all of the events of this summer and winter. I will note the Climate Action Office wasn't involved in immediate flood response or recovery that really lasted through September. but our office and the Interagency Advisory Board with respect to climate resilience play a role in coordinating efforts to really think about how we enhance our program delivery for folks regarding disasters exacerbated by climate change. So getting to those tools I said I was going to get to, much of my focus over the last year has been to develop tools intended to build climate resilience into the lexicon of day-to-day municipal planning and project implementation. So it's easier for communities across the state to adapt to climate change and build that into their existing work. I have a slide each for two tools, would welcome separate conversations to get into more detail on them, as I know we don't have a whole lot of time today. So these will remain at a fairly high level, but happy to answer questions or come back at another time. So the first tool you'll see a mock-up on the screen here is what we're calling the Municipal Climate Toolkit. It's a key recommendation that comes from the Global Warming Solutions Act requirement to recommend tools for municipalities to assess their climate resilience. This toolkit's being developed and led with ANR through a partnership with the Vermont Climate Council. The goal of this toolkit is to provide a centralized hub for information relevant for designing and implementing climate action measures or strategies, as well as information on financial resources and technical assistance for municipalities. We're intending it to be a one-stop shop or perhaps two-stop shop for municipalities looking to incorporate climate change into their municipal planning and processes. Currently, tools and resources and technical assistance that address various aspects of climate change exist across state government, but there's not one location that links all those resources together and provides an avenue for folks to ultimately see how their work fits into this broader lens of climate change action. So the mock-up here on the screen shows a sample of what resources could look like. We're intending to have them grouped both by topic area and resource type. Each topic area will include an overview of the topic and how that relates to and is impacted by climate change. We've been working on this toolkit for a while. We're having some delays due to IT issues, but hope to roll it out later this spring. I'm so excited to share that with municipalities and really think about how we can continue to build out this toolkit to better connect to grants, data, financial resources, and case studies for communities to incorporate climate change into their work.
We have a question from Representative Stebbins.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. Are you coordinating with the RPCs or with VACTA on this?
Yes, yeah. So we've had extensive stakeholder engagement with municipalities and RPCs on the toolkit,
Okay.
and intend to, and I'll get to it with sort of the next tool and resource, but are really thinking about how we build out a partnership, sort of codified partnership with RPCs to help roll out a lot of these resources. Yeah.
Because it's definitely not a one-stop shop if you don't have all their. Yeah. Great. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So the next tool, again, just one slide for each, but happy to come back and speak to it in more detail. This is a resource we also expect to have completed later this spring that we're calling the Municipal Vulnerability Index tool. This is also a requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and again, is being developed in partnership with the Climate Council. The Municipal Vulnerability Index, or MVI, will be a user-guided geospatial mapping tool intended to help municipalities understand and explore their vulnerabilities to climate change across a range of social, economic, and biophysical factors. The MVI will help Vermont communities identify where climate change is placing pressures on various sectors and will help inform planning priorities and work on hazard mitigation plans, local energy plans, emergency response plans, et cetera. What you see on the slide here, the 5 bullets, are domains or groupings of potential vulnerability indicators that will be displayed again in a geospatial form in this mapping tool. We're using Vermont-specific data where possible and are aligning with other existing tools like the Social Vulnerability Index, BioFinder, the Flood Ready Atlas, and others. We will be also including geospatial data on climate hazards where we have it, and are aligning those hazards in the tool with the hazards that are identified in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. The MVI will use climate hazard data where we have it from local data sets and those with climate projections whenever possible. And then we will also, of course, be incorporating regional and national data sets as needed. Vermont's not alone in lacking authoritative sort of peer-reviewed climate, local and state data for climate projections, particularly in a geospatial form. So we are building this tool with a mind towards future incorporation of climate projections as they become more readily available. So again, this is intended to be sort of a flexible user-guided approach. If folks are familiar with using BioFinder, where you can turn layers on and off and sort of see overlays of particular factors, that will be what this tool will look like. It's not going to spit out a single vulnerability score, but will rather provide a way for municipalities and other partners to see factors in the social and community space, built and physical environment, natural hazards, and overlays natural environment and overlays with natural hazards where we have it. And we'll also include a system of flagging so that we can better indicate the presence and scale of vulnerability for particular factors that will be in this tool. I just received a draft of this tool on Monday of this week. We'll be beta testing the tool with a handful of municipalities, as well as our task group made up of members of the Vermont Climate Council later this month, with the intent to have the tool ready to go in April of this year. To your question, Rep. Stebbins, on working with regional planning commissions, we are also hoping and working to partner with RPCs to help us train on the tool with municipalities and other local partners once complete. This will look both like trainings with municipalities and partners, as well as working with RPCs to develop profiles or municipal guides that will really show how the tool can be used to connect to existing planning and project implementation work that municipalities or RPCs will do. I'm looking forward to that collaboration. So wrapping up, as I said earlier, the Climate Action Office was established to support a state vision for climate action. And there are a number of projects on our horizon that we see as instrumental to helping us better understand the impact of the work we're doing in state government, to better and more efficiently provide resources and technical assistance on climate resilience to municipalities and other partners, and to provide information and communication support to decision makers as we grapple with the more severe impacts of climate change on our state. I've highlighted some of the upcoming work on the slide here. I don't think we have time to go through all of them, but we'll note that we see all of this work, as well as our coordination with the Interagency Advisory Board, as both important standalone tools or resources, but also building blocks to get to a better understanding of what it takes for our communities and our state to be more resilient to climate change. So in closing, the Climate Action Office has been around for a little over a year. We have a lot of work ahead of us with partners and are excited about providing a space to speak collectively about state climate resilience vision that gets us to a place of a more resilient Vermont. So with that, happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. Do members have questions? Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming in. Would your office have already, I see planning on here as part of your office responsibility. It's the first one on the slide, by the way. So I'm wondering, when we talk about planning for municipalities or pinch points where we have problems, are you going to get into mitigation issue or possibilities of what we can do to mitigate some of these hazard points, and offer suggestions, or to look at how we could mitigate some of these? And I reference sediment removal in certain areas, which we're not allowed now, or berming in certain areas, or I know we're doing things with oversized culverts, or removing them and putting in the full span arch bridge or type thing. So is it going to include that, or am I looking at too high of a level or low of a level detail?
No, it's a good question. I think, so a lot of that planning work that municipalities take on, which I think Stephanie will be able to speak to, happens through their writing of their local hazard mitigation plans, which really allows them to do an analysis of what hazards they're facing and then what actions they can take to mitigate the impacts of those hazards, as you're speaking to. And that's really that planning that happens at a local level. I think the Climate Action Office, our role, particularly in the resilience adaptation space, is helping to coordinate within state governments with the work that's already happening and provide those resources to our other partners. I will say in planning, there's, again, the work that municipalities do with local hazard mitigation planning. Some municipalities also take on energy planning work. There's sort of a lot of planning that happens in the municipal space and the regional space as well. And you'll see on the slide here, one of the things we're working on is thinking about providing a framework or sort of a guide for communities to think through what would a climate action plan look like, understanding the work we're already doing in the hazard mitigation, emergency management, energy planning space, and sort of connecting those pieces into a climate planning framework. So that's a sort of a space where we're looking to provide some additional assistance. It's not specifically in the, speaking to development of berms or sediment removal.
On hydraulics.
Right, but I think our connection and our work with the Rivers Program at ANR, again, Stephanie's office at VEM, provides that connection and framework for communities to have those conversations and be able to connect with technical assistance partners who really have that expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does your office have an inventory of all of the programs for climate adaptation and resilience, and not in your department, but we have a lot of bills trying to address problems and in understanding what's already happening that really doesn't need to be reinvented would be incredibly helpful. And so do you maintain that?
We don't have a full picture of that, but I will say prior to the Climate Council being stood up, there was an inventory done of what programs exist across state government for greenhouse gas mitigation and climate adaptation and resilience. And that's, I don't know if it's an extensive list, but it's a good starting point to get a sense of where there are programs and sort of, it's just an Excel document, but programs that address climate adaptation and resilience. The second part to answer your question is that analysis of where programs exist within state government for climate adaptation and resilience, and also an understanding of where there are gaps, is something we're really interested in and are pursuing as sort of a future work project. And we'll actually connect closely with the resilience implementation strategy that the Governor and Treasurer's Office just announced recently. Is really doing an audit, might not be the right word, but an analysis of existing state programs and projects and where there's overlap and gaps in the adaptation and resilience space. So sort of two parts to your question. One, it's not something we currently maintain, but are interested in doing soon. But there was a list created prior to the Climate Council being stood up that we could share as a resource.
That'd be great if you could send us that. And then it strikes me that perhaps is it in the climate action plan, an inventory of these programs?
Not directly in the plan. No, it was created for the council to sort of reference and the subcommittee to reference as they developed actions in the climate action plan, but it's not included in the plan currently.
Thanks. And thanks for in advance for sending that. And thank you again for your presentation. Yeah. We will shift gears. And welcome Stephanie Smith from Vermont Emergency Management.
Thank you all so much for having us back. I'm sorry we got cut off at the last meeting, but I appreciate the opportunity to come back. Let me just make this full screen. All right, so hi, I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management. So I manage our hazard mitigation program with the goal of making Vermont safer and more resilient in the face of climate change and natural hazards. So I know this session was posed as the Agency of Natural Resources and what they're doing, but incredibly grateful to Secretary Moore for letting me be a part of that party, because I work incredibly closely with everyone you heard from last week and with Marion as we advance this work. We can't do it without this entire group. So all working very collaboratively together, which has been great. So I'll start briefly on the planning side. Within the program, we have planning and grants. I'll spend most of my time on grants, but wanted to tell you about our state hazard mitigation plan, which is a document that we update every 5 years. And we just received approval for the 2023 plan in November. So we have a brand new version that was just FEMA approved. And the state hazard mitigation plan assesses all of the natural hazards that Vermont is vulnerable to, and it poses a mitigation strategy to improve resilience, reduce future risk across state government, and it cuts across state government. It includes stakeholders outside of state government. So the intent really there is to figure out how do we create those synergies, and that's part of what, as Marion spoke to, trying to figure out how to make sure that's connected with the climate action plan and that they're speaking to each other, and it's all part of the set of how we propose a more resilient future for Vermont. So that's the state hazard mitigation plan. And on the funding side, I'll spend most of my time on this slide. On the FEMA side, I'll focus on mainly the hazard mitigation grant program here, which is this top one. So we receive an allocation under this program whenever we have a federally declared disaster in the state. So the amount available is dependent on the scale of that disaster, but the funding can be spent anywhere in the state. So it doesn't have to be tied to the locations that were hit. It doesn't even have to be flood related. The idea is proactive future risk reduction through this program. So to give you some context, following Tropical Storm Irene, we had about $34 million in this program. It's still a little early to know final numbers, but we're looking at probably 75 million or more following the July flood. So it's by far the largest pot of this FEMA round that we've ever had. And with this pot, we can do a variety of different things. So that includes property buyouts, which I'll speak a little more to in a minute, project scoping activities, which is what allows us to develop projects, floodplain restoration work, infrastructure projects such as upsizing culverts or bridges, or we've done a couple of dam removals as well, residential property elevations and floodproofing projects for commercial or municipal buildings. So all that's within the realm of possible here. And we can also do utility resilience projects. So things that protect against ice and wind vulnerabilities. Doesn't necessarily have to be tied to flooding, although that is the bulk of what we fund. FEMA funding under this program requires a 25% local match. We have a one-time general fund allocation right now, which will allow us to cover match for property buyouts specifically. We have 5 million left in that pot, which will get us to the first 20 million worth of buyouts. Under this $75 million. So it gets us to about 50 properties. One other FEMA program that I'll note, so flood mitigation assistance, Swift Current is on here. This is a relatively new program from FEMA, so we just got a new announcement of it last fall. Nationally, there's $300 million available. It's specifically for states that have recent disaster declarations. So Vermont is eligible for up to 40 million under this pot following the July flood. It's a brand new program for us. So we're learning very quickly and trying to make sure we get an application so we can utilize those dollars. And the funding is specifically intended to reduce risk to the National Flood Insurance Pool. So the requirements are a little bit more narrow here. So it's for properties that have flood insurance and they're either a repetitive loss property, a severe repetitive loss property, or they were considered substantially damaged within this last flood. So if they meet one of those three definitions, which are specifically defined by FEMA, then this pot can be used for those property buyouts of those structures, elevations, or potentially relocation projects where we're lifting up a house and moving it to a different, safer location. So the deadline for applications under this pot is May 15th. So it's coming up really fast, but we're starting to work with communities on getting those applications in. And then at the top of the screen here, we also have state ARPA funding, which is our program called the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. This was one of the top priorities in the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan to create a program that fills gaps in what we can't fund with FEMA dollars. So it allows us to be creative. It allows us to take away some of the administrative burden for towns to try and make it easier. That's been this pot for us. It's been a really phenomenal opportunity to build that program over the last few years. And the main focus there is on, we can fund other things as well, but the focus is projects including buyouts that are not eligible for FEMA funding. One of the main reasons properties are ineligible for FEMA funding is that they're outside of the FEMA MAP special flood hazard area, which is a line that denotes inundation risk, which is water coming up and spilling out onto a floodplain, where in Vermont, within the state hazard mitigation plan, that's our second ranked hazard. Our first highest ranked hazard is fluvial erosion risk, which is water coming off of mountains, cutting around corners. Rob Evans spoke a little bit to this last week. So really trying to capture risk in that area, which is broader than just the FEMA map that we're looking at. So that's one of the biggest things we've been able to do through this program. And we had about 20 million total from ARPA funding, and we just obligated the final 3 million of this program in December. So we're currently implementing those projects, but we don't have any additional funding to obligate under that program. And a little bit more on buyouts. So since Tropical Storm Irene, our program has completed about 170 buyouts across the state, across various funding programs. Property buyouts are voluntary for the property owner as well as the community. The community generally ends up owning the parcel following the buyout, and they're required to maintain it as market space in perpetuity. So the idea is nothing else will be there that's vulnerable, that's going to flood in the future. The majority have been residential, but commercial properties are eligible as well. And we've done a few of those, and we have a few more that I think we'll be doing following July. One of the nice things about these programs is that we're able to do day before the storm values for properties that flooded during this event. So the property appraisals are based on the value as of July 9th, as though nothing had happened. And then with the match funding, we're able to offer 100% of that value to property owners. And if they weren't flooded, we can also do current market appraisals. So it's not required that they have past flooding, it's required that they have flood risk. And directly following the July flood, one of the first things we did was to set up an intake form for property owners that were interested, because we were starting to hear from people very quickly following that event. We have well over 250 responses on that form now, and it's still open. My team and I have been meeting with communities over the last few months to have initial conversations to start developing applications. So if we have a town that's very motivated and property owners that are motivated, we're able to start pulling those applications together and answering questions for towns that are unsure and helping them figure out a path forward. So far, we've submitted a couple of applications on the FEMA side. So one for a landslide buyout in Ripton. So one of, when you heard from Ben DeYoung last week, he talked about the landslides and doing assessments for FEMA buyouts. One of the requirements for that program is that we have a letter from the state geologist saying that it's at imminent risk of failure. So we worked very closely on quite a few potential landslide buyouts following the July flood. And then we've also submitted 2 buyouts in Hardwick. So that's what's gone to FEMA so far. But we have about 10 million worth of property buyouts that we're getting ready to submit that will go to FEMA over the next month or 2. So we're not waiting for the end of the funding round for the buyouts. As soon as we have applications, everything signed and in from communities, we're sending them to FEMA so that they can get into their review queue.
We have a question from Representative Bond.
More just kind of like something.
Yep.
It's just that, just think about as we go along, because one of the challenges with the buyouts, which I think are great, and they makes all the sense in the world. But I did have, when I was talking with one flooded homeowner group, and we had John Booker Campbell there for a bit. And one of the residents leaned over to me and said, so I get 400,000, then what? So we have to be thinking about where do they go? Because that's got to be part of this equation. So I put that out there as we think about this, but the buyouts are great. I'm glad they're available.
So absolutely. And I think we're hearing this time, and following Irene, buyouts were the biggest solution that we did. We did a couple of elevation projects as well, but I think we're getting a lot more interest in elevating. And if it is in that inundation risk area, elevation might make sense. I've been getting questions this week about relocation, which is possible, but it's something we've never actually done with FEMA funding. I think for properties where I think it'll depend a lot on the structure, whether that makes sense or not. So if it's a double wide mobile home that we can lift up more easily and move or something like that, something that's manufactured or something on a slab, I think that's all within the realm of possible, as long as we have a site to put it on. So I think there are other opportunities. And then it's also why we're looking at these larger projects as well, like are there large floodplain restoration projects? I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute where we've been able to do larger projects that reduce risk more broadly, and maybe that allows us to keep people in place. So yeah, it's all part of the set for sure. Thank you.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation.
Mhm.
What is your anticipated turnaround time dealing with FEMA?
Yes, so I get that question a lot. We're getting it to FEMA as quickly as we can because it is going to take a little while to go through the FEMA review queue. So they're a little low on staff right now, but we've been working with them over the last few years between Irene and now, where we have a really good application that we're putting together that speaks to what they need. And so we're trying to make it as quick, as streamlined as we can through the process, but it could easily take 6 months or more within FEMA review once it gets there.
Thank you.
And would you say that the 250 people who are registered is the demand, or is the demand significantly different from that?
It's a great question. I think it's hard to tell at this point for a couple of reasons. I think that initial list, we'll see some attrition. There will be people that they were interested or they wanted to know more, but they're not going to end up doing it. But then once we start working in a community, we're sitting down with the town, we're talking to them, we're working with the property owners, and then their neighbors are seeing, oh, this is real and this is happening. I'm interested now too. So I think we'll see more coming in as we start to do projects as well. So I think we'll see some attrition, but I think we'll see more interest as well. So it's hard to tell right now where we'll land, but I think I'll have a better sense in 6 months.
And are they getting easier? You've done 170 since Irene, which is like Ray, but you have 250 now.
Yes. So one of the things that we're doing this round that we've never done before is we're implementing a state-run buyout program for communities that are interested. And every community I've talked to so far has been very interested, which looks like Vermont Emergency Management submitting the application to FEMA and then having a signed MOU in it with the town saying that they'll still end up owning the parcel. They'll still be required to maintain it as open space and meet those requirements, but we're going to manage the money. So that allows us to hire one entity to do all of the appraisals, which again, the significant hope is that makes it a lot faster, because once we have that person hired, we get the FEMA award and we can say, go do the appraisal. And we don't have to wait for the town to have a sub-grant agreement and for the town to then go procure someone. And so I think that will take a lot of the administrative burden off of the towns and then also make it a lot faster because we'll already have someone to do the legal work lined up who can start pulling the title, developing closing documents, someone lined up to do demo as soon as it's ready. So that's one way that we're trying to make it a lot easier for our towns. And I think honestly, it'll make it easier for us too, because we're right now providing a lot of customer support to our towns through that process. And if we're managing the funding, we won't need to be doing that piece. So the scale has gone up a lot, but I think we're working very hard to find what are those opportunities to make it easier for everybody all around.
Now, I know you have more slides to get to, but I was going to ask about how are you working with the no staff communities, because it can be very complicated for them, and that's great. I hear what you've just done for this program. Are there other ways you're able to do that to support towns that don't have any staff?
Yeah, we're trying to the best of our ability based on our capacity. I was also talking to Sarah Waring from USDA Rural Development yesterday, who's working on building a new technical assistance program that I'm hoping can fill some of that gap as well, especially for the communities that have less ability to even contemplate managing a FEMA grant. But again, with this buyout model, they won't have to manage the grant. So then it's really meeting with the select board and making sure they understand and are okay with the property being vacant, which is another really hard conversation to have with towns, especially given the housing market and grant lists and all of that. So we're having those conversations and trying to talk them through the process. I have just a little bit more. Under the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, I just wanted to note that there are a couple of buyouts that have already gone into that program for that last $3 million following July. So that's buyouts in Hardwick, Marshfield, Middlebury, Wolcott, Cambridge, and Montpelier. So we're starting to get those projects in. And then one other project type that I'll talk about, and then I want to show you just a couple of examples. So directly following the flooding in July, one other thing that we did was submit a scoping application to FEMA. So it allows us this project will allow us to work with some of the hardest hit communities to develop potential projects that can lower flood elevations within their downtowns. It's a collaborative effort with the DEC Rivers team, with ACCD, with the regional planning commissions, and Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Planning Commission is going to manage the engineering contract for us, and they'll be partnering with the other RPCs to work in their regions. So that's very exciting. It's just getting off the ground now, and it includes some funding from Vermont Housing and Community and Conservation Board to pay the RPCs to help provide that community outreach and support. So I think it's probably going to be like a $2.5 million project to start working in some of the hardest hit towns and develop projects that we can submit under that 75 million that I talked about. So we're just at the beginning of that project, but looking forward to being able to tell you more about it soon. And then we're also accepting scoping projects from communities. So Cambridge has already submitted one that's already gone to FEMA. So that's open for communities to be submitting projects right now to help them figure out what they should do to move forward. Okay, so that's all I had on the funding, but I'd love to show you a couple of examples of projects that were completed following Irene that were incredibly successful in July. So one of those is in Northfields. There's this beautiful Dog River Park in Northfields. So everything in green with a number, that's a property that was a buyout. And they were able to create this beautiful community park, do a floodplain restoration project to lower flood elevations within this neighborhood. So most of the time it's this nice asset for the community. And then in July, it filled up with floodwaters and it lowered flood elevations in the surrounding neighborhood. So this is a really successful project, and we're looking to be able to do more of this type of thing following the July flood. And then a couple of large floodplain restoration projects that I'll talk about. And again, the focus here is very much on how do we give the river space where we can, so we slow it down before it gets into our downtowns. So these are two projects just upstream on the Whetstone of Brattleboro, these were in the black, those were senior housing facility buildings. Those residents were relocated. We were able to demolish those buildings, do another large floodplain restoration project, put in an overflow culvert, lower flood elevations in the surrounding neighborhood. And that's
Stebbins.
Sorry, so that map, can you go back?
yes.
So the blue is where the river flooded.
The blue is where we did the restoration work.
Okay,
Yes, and I'll show you a picture.
the river actually,
This
like
one.
they're not actually in the river.
No, but they were in the floodway. Yes, it was a very high risk area and they were evacuated during Irene. Yes, that was really being able to move this vulnerable population. And then this view might help. So this was the December 2022 flood, which looked a lot like the December 2023 flood that we just had. But if you see the snow line there, that's where the water was on that site. And there, this building in the middle is their office space for Brattleboro Housing Authority, but the homes were all around here. So I was able to access that floodplain, nothing flooded. And it lowered flood elevations for the surrounding neighborhoods.
Representative Stebbins, then Smith.
So one of my concerns always is that we do these projects where we resize a culvert, and it's not to like the 1,000-year storm, it's to like the 250-year storm or the 500-year storm. And it's like the 1,000-year storm is going to be here soon. It's not going to be 1,000 years. What storm evaluation are you putting these on? Because to be honest, like the snow line doesn't look that far from the building that's still there.
From the structure, yeah, it's a little bit higher, thankfully, but you're absolutely right. And I think and I talk with the Rivers team about this a lot too, and Rob Evans, who you guys spoke with last week. It's all of these projects, like looking at these two large restorations, those are one piece of this full set. And as water gets higher, we're going to need to find even more opportunities. So It's not removing flood risk, it's lowering the elevation a little bit. So each one of these is incremental progress, but as we see more rain coming in, we're going to have to keep doing more and more. So that's absolutely part of how we're thinking about it.
But are you basing it on, what flood year for a lot of those projects?
Yeah, on the FEMA side, it depends. It depends on the local regulations. It depends if it's a state building, they'd be required to meet the DEC requirements, which are like, if it's an elevation, it's 2 foot above base flood elevation, which is they're encouraging communities to go that high. So it's going to depend on the project. I don't remember the elevations on this one exactly.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you. What are your thoughts on dredging?
So I would point you back to Rob Evans, who we spoke with, who you guys spoke with last week, to speak to that in more detail. My understanding from talking to him many times is that it tends to exacerbate the problem further on. So making the river deeper makes it faster and it increases erosion around the
Makes
stream.
it faster to get out, too.
And it increases erosion, which is, again, that erosion risk is our biggest hazard in the state, not the inundation risk. So it's the forces that undercut a bank and then a house falls into the river, like we saw during Tropical Storm Irene. So it's trying to prevent that sort of dynamic where we're destabilizing a river and increasing erosion risk.
I wish you hadn't talked to him, but I would like to hear your opinion.
Well, we work very closely. And
I can see that.
All part of the,
Thank you very much.
absolutely. Okay, and this is another one. So you can see, this actually shows the building being a little bit higher at least. And then the Whetstone was the other one. And then I think this is the last project I had on here. Oh, there might be one more. Is this Brandon overflow culvert. So this Brandon is a community that was hit very heavily during Irene, and the floodwaters from the Neshobe, they're on the top here. You can see where they're coming down, and it went straight through downtown. Now this overflow culvert gives the river the opportunity to go underneath the community instead of over it. So most of the time it's empty, there's no water in there, but during a high flow event, it gives the river a little bit space. It's like a pressure release to give the river somewhere else to go. This one's been successful many times since they installed it. And then the last one, this is a Cambridge project we did in Cambridge to upsize the trail bridge. So you can see the really tiny trail bridge at the beginning of this and how incised it is in the river. We were able to put in this much larger span, restore floodplain underneath, and again, give the river space, slow it down before it gets into our communities. And that's all I had for you guys, but I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Representative Stebbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The picture 2 pictures ago in Brandon, so that's normally dry. So there's no impact to like any of the various critters or species that would normally be
In the
going
river.
up and down the stream?
Yeah, so that's exactly, so it's not
Okay.
impacting.
So
the
it's really
river,
the
it's just
smell.
giving it an extra space if it needs it.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so the water comes down here, and this is the top corner in this picture.
Yeah,
It's the top corner, so it usually goes around the community this way. But in Irene, it went straight. This is the downtown, it went straight through. So it gives it that opportunity instead of, because naturally the river's not gonna want to go around something. If it's too high, it's gonna just want to plow through. So this gives it the space to do that.
Move the pizza shop right down the middle of the road.
There's really cool stuff that,
Just a question on that picture right there. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Was that armored
Um,
to direct the water to go through there?
there's actually grade control there. There's actually, there's bedrock adjacent and nearby. So
And
I
I don't have the downstream photo.
actually kind of worked on part of this, both of those projects previously, the Brattleboro and then this one. But it's a ledge grade control, natural. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you all.
thank you.
All right, members, we will take about a 5-minute